It is often said that Chickamauga is Cherokee for River of Death. Now, while the true meaning of Chickamauga is up for debate, what is not up for debate is the bloodshed that took place here in September of 1863. After nearly 3 days of fighting, nearly 34,000 men were killed, wounded, and captured on these fields behind us here. And we're here to find out why the Battle of Chickamauga was so deadly.
Now, before we cover the actions at Alexander's Bridge, we are first going to cover the actions at Reed's Bridge. On the morning of September 18th of 1863, Confederate General Braxton Bragg would march his army towards the banks of the Chickamauga Creek. His goal was to cross the creek, cut off and destroy a lone Union Army corps under the command of Thomas Crittenden, and then he would attempt to retake Chattanooga before the Union Army was able to consolidate. In order for this plan to work, Bragg would cross the Chickamauga Creek at 4 points: Thetford's Ford, Dalton's Ford, the Alexander Bridge, and right here at Reed's Bridge. Now, defending Reed's Bridge was Colonel Robert Minty and his 973 men. On a morning of September 18th, Minty would order 2 patrols beyond the bridge. One of these patrols, commanded by Captain Weber Thompson of the 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry, collided with Confederate infantry near Peavine Creek. Private Samuel Walters of the 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry would be credited with firing the first shots of the Battle of Chickamauga. The Confederate infantry would push over the creek, driving back the outnumbered Union cavalry. Minty's men would delay the Confederate infantry as long as they could. Sometime after 2 p.m., the Confederate infantry was finally able to reach Reed's Bridge. They began to push across under stiff resistance by Colonel Minty's men. Colonel Minty and his small force began to fall back. They had succeeded in their goal by delaying the Confederate force as long as they could. Now, while this fight was happening, Confederate infantry was now approaching Alexander's Bridge, which is where we're headed next.
Alright, so we've moved locations from Reed's Bridge, which is in this general direction, and we are at Alexander's Bridge. So on September 17th, Colonel John T. Wilder and his Lightning Brigade arrived in this area, and they were tasked with holding Alexander Bridge that you see before us here. Shortly after arriving in this area, Wilder would personally climb a tree on the Alexander property, and he would see dust clouds in the distance, which meant only one thing: the Confederates were advancing on this location here.
That is the advance of Bragg's army. Colonel John Wilder, commander of the Lightning Brigade.
Now, holding this general area here was the 17th Indiana, 5 companies of the 98th Illinois, 3 companies of the 72nd Indiana, and panning to my left here, you had 4 3-inch ordnance rifles under the command of Captain Eli Lilly and his 18th Indiana Battery. So they were back there quite a ways. Now, Wilder's brigade was a little different than the rest of the forces in the Union Army. They were what you called mounted infantry. Now, you're probably wondering, what's the difference between cavalry and mounted infantry? Well, Wilder's men rode into battle as if they were cavalrymen, but they fought as infantry. So they didn't have swords or sabers or lances. They would ride into battle, dismount, and fight as infantry. Now, they also had another advantage. They were sporting 7-shot Spencer rifles here at Chickamauga. Now, originally there was a little confusion about how Wilder would acquire these Spencer rifles. There were some rumors going around that he was personally writing bankers and investors in order to finance these rifles personally for his men. But in the end, the Spencer rifles that Wilder's men had here at Chickamauga were government issued. So after several inquiries, they finally got the Spencer rifle, and it would prove to be a great equalizer here, especially at Alexander's Bridge. So we are facing what is now the Alexander Bridge. Now, during the time of the battle, this bridge would have been wood. As you can see here, it's been redone, and now you see the steel there. But this is the exact location of where Wilder's men were holding Alexander Bridge. Now, it's also important to know that fighting was taking place at Reed's Bridge in this general area here. So while we're here at Chickamauga, keep in mind that as we're covering a specific event or a specific unit, that there are multiple things happening at the same time. So on the morning of September 18th of 1863, Wilder would send out a foraging party in this direction, and they would be foraging for food and supplies and things of that nature, where they would encounter Confederate pickets, and they would race back to this location, and Wilder knew it was only a matter of time before the Confederates were bearing down on this location. Now, around 12 p.m. on September 18th of 1863, with fighting raging near Reed's Bridge in this general area, about 350 yards to the east of Alexander Bridge here, a brigade of Confederates under the command of Brigadier General Edward Walthall and his Mississippi Brigade began to emerge and form lines of battle in anticipation of assaulting Reed's Bridge here. Now, Wilder's men did prepare some hasty fortifications here. They began tearing up the wood planks on Reed's Bridge here, and they constructed somewhat of a small redoubt in this general area here. And also, they caused damage to the bridge, so it would also slow the progress of anyone trying to cross it. But there was also something working in Wilder's favor here. Now, we mentioned the 7-shot Spencer rifles, but the banks of the Chickamauga are extremely steep, which would really hinder an army trying to cross. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So obviously you have Alexander's Bridge here, and looking down directly across from us, you can see the steepness of the banks here. And looking down this way, you can see just how steep the banks are on each side. Now, you're probably wondering how a soldier in the 1860s couldn't cross that. It looks pretty passable, but keep in mind you have thousands of soldiers, wagons, artillery. Those pieces couldn't cross these steep banks, so they needed bridges and fords to be able to cross the Chickamauga here and execute Bragg's plan of pinning the Union Army against the mountains and destroying it. So we are currently in the position of the 17th Indiana Mounted Infantry here. And just to orient you, Alexander Bridge is right here. So again, we are on the west side of the Chickamauga Creek. The Confederates began deploying around noon their lines of battle. Edward Walthall's Mississippi Brigade began deploying about 350 yards to this location. So something to note about the terrain here. The banks of the creek were wooded, but a lot of this area behind the bridge here would have been cleared out and been farmland belonging to the Alexanders, which were down this way a little bit where Eli Lilly deployed his battery. So a lot of this was open fields, and really the only wooded areas were along the banks of the Chickamauga here. Now, we have hopped over to the area where the 72nd Indiana Infantry had some skirmishers and the general area of the 98th Illinois Mounted Infantry. So I just wanted to show you their perspective as well, and for orientation purposes, there's Alexander's Bridge, and we were just on the other side of the bridge here talking about the 17th Indiana. But let's imagine something here. You're a skirmisher in Wilder's brigade. Masses of Confederate columns are coming straight at us here. You have Eli Lilly's 3-inch ordnance rifles hurling shells over your head. Think about the sounds that would have made. Think about the rebel yell coming straight at us, and just knowing that you're funneling that infantry into a choke point that is Alexander's Bridge Road. Now, the Confederates would make a few attacks in this general direction, and they would come to realize that this position was too strong, and they would move their men down this general direction and cross at a ford. Now, again, like we touched on earlier in the video, keep in mind there's still fighting happening at Reed's Bridge. So we've moved to the east side of the Chickamauga Creek now, and I wanted to show you this battle from the Confederate perspective, at least the best I can. So keep in mind, remember, in this area, a lot of the foliage you're seeing was open fields. So Walt Hull's men began forming lines of battle about 350 yards in this general direction here. They began getting hit with artillery fire from Eli Lilly's battery, and they began forming on this side of the Alexander Bridge Road. Now, as they were advancing towards Wilder's position here, you had the 30th, the 34th, and the 29th Mississippi kind of drift off in this direction here. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about regiments, a couple hundred men in each regiment, so they would take up a lot of this real estate here. But once these three regiments essentially kind of drifted, the 29th Mississippi found themselves directly in the middle of the Alexander Bridge Road here, and they were exposed and they got chewed up by Wilder's men who were on the banks of the Chickamauga. So on this side you had the 98th Illinois Mounted Infantry, you had that makeshift fort that they built in the middle of the road, and then on this side you had the 17th Indiana.
They came up in splendid style, lines well dressed, step firm, even and steady, bayonets fixed and gleaming in the sun. Sergeant James Barnes, 72nd Indiana.
My regiment struck the enemy in considerable force near and immediately in front of the bridge above mentioned, and a fierce engagement ensued. I pressed forward with my command and took possession of the bridge, which had been so torn up as to prevent crossing. In this engagement, the loss of my regiment was 56 killed and wounded. Colonel William Brantley, 29th Mississippi Infantry.
Now, you also had an additional Confederate brigade in this area. You had Colonel Daniel Govan's Arkansas Brigade, and they were forming predominantly on the west side of the Alexander Bridge Road here. So Wilder's small contingent of mounted infantry with their 7-shot Spencers held off 2 full Confederate brigades for hours in this general area here. And you can kind of see, you're attacking this location, there's not a whole lot of cover. So these men were exposed, no doubt. Minty and Wilder would fight a day-long delaying action against an overwhelming number of Confederate infantry, and in doing so, derailed Braxton Bragg's plan to turn the Union Army's northern flank and crush it against the mountains of northern Georgia. Now, some think that Chickamauga was just a 2-day battle, September 19th and 20th, but in fact, the battle truly started on September 18th of 1863, right here at Alexander's Bridge and Reed's Bridge. Pretty cool little area, and it's always interesting to learn about some of the unique units in both armies, and I hope that this sheds some light on Wilder's Lightning Brigade. And let's see what else Chickamauga has in store for us here.